The soup was still warm through the glass when Brielle heard it. She didn't gasp, didn't set the container down too hard against the wall, didn't press her hand over her mouth the way people do in movies when something breaks in them. She just stood there in the carpeted hallway outside Conference Room B on the 14th floor of the Aldrich Group's headquarters, and she heard her husband's voice through the 2-inch gap in the door, and she felt something she had not expected. Relief. Not grief. Not the white-hot surge of fury she might have imagined once. Just relief. The specific, clarifying relief of a woman who has been asking herself a question for 2 years and has finally, standing in a hallway with a soup container and no audience, received her answer. If you have ever loved someone who made you feel like a detail they hadn't quite gotten around to, this is the part where you take a breath. Stay with me through the end of this. And if this is your first time here, subscribe to Hidden Desire Stories and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel. The Friday ritual had started almost 3 years ago in the ordinary way that rituals do, not with intention, but with a single unremarkable act that somehow repeated itself until it became the shape of something. Tobias had been in the middle of a brutal acquisition stretch, the kind that ran for 6 weeks and consumed everything in its path. He'd called Brielle at 9 on a Friday evening and said, without preamble, that he'd missed lunch again and probably dinner, and that the office coffee had run out around 2 in the afternoon, and the way he said it wasn't a complaint. It was just a fact, like weather, like traffic. Brielle had made soup, the good kind, the one with orzo and lemon rind and thyme that her grandmother used to keep simmering on the back burner in October. She'd driven 40 minutes into downtown Chicago, talked her way past the lobby security because she didn't have a visitor badge, and found Tobias in his glass-walled office at the top of the building, with his tie loosened and 3 whiteboards covered in numbers and his assistant Garrison standing in the corner, looking like a man who hadn't sat down since breakfast. Tobias had looked at the soup container and then at her, and something in the carefully controlled geometry of his face had shifted, just briefly, just enough. "You drove here for this?" he'd said. "You hadn't eaten." "I'm fine." "You said that yesterday. You also said you'd eat before the 3 o'clock." He'd taken the soup. He'd eaten it standing at his desk. After that, it became Fridays. Every Friday, without exception, through 2 winters and 1 spring that nearly cost Tobias the Western regional contracts, and a summer when his board of directors had turned on each other publicly enough to end up in the Tribune. She'd still shown up on those Fridays, chicken soup or turkey chili, or once in late November, when she hadn't had time, a container of the lemon pound cake she kept in the freezer for emergencies. And Garrison, who had the careful eyes of a man who had spent years watching a room for things the room didn't notice about itself, had always been the one to come out first. He'd say, "He's finishing a call, Mrs. Calloway," with the particular gentleness of someone who understood that he was delivering more than a message, and she'd sit in the small seating area near the elevator and wait. She had never minded the waiting. That was the thing most people, including Tobias, had fundamentally misread about her. Brielle was 37 years old. She ran a women's health clinic on the west side of the city, a real clinic, the kind that saw patients who didn't have the luxury of choosing between rent and a copay. She'd built it from a 2-room suite into a staff of 11 in 6 years. She had opinions that she expressed directly, and a particular way of looking at people that made them feel, sometimes uncomfortably, that she was seeing something they'd left out of the official version of themselves. She had, on at least 3 occasions, told Tobias to his face that he was making a decision from fear instead of strategy and been right every time, which he had acknowledged with the specific reluctance of a man who respected accuracy and resented it simultaneously. She was not a woman who endured things passively. She was not soft in the way that people sometimes mean when they say soft, like it's a category that means safe to discount. She had loved Tobias Aldrich with both eyes open. She'd known what he was when she married him. She had simply underestimated, they both had, what that kind of life costs the people who live inside it. The erosion didn't announce itself. It never does with marriages that matter. It was the accumulated weight of small absences. The dinner she'd made going cold on the counter while she put their daughter Flo to bed alone again. The way his phone became a third presence at every meal, insistent and pulling. The morning she reached across and found the sheets cool, undisturbed, his side abandoned before she'd surfaced, and how, somewhere along the way, she'd stopped reaching. That was the part she hadn't told anyone about. The stopping. Because Brielle was not someone who stopped. She was someone who said the thing directly and waited for the other person to meet her there. But with Tobias, she'd started going quiet. Not out of fear, she'd never been afraid of him. Out of something worse. The slow-growing certainty that saying the words out loud would only confirm what she'd already begun to suspect. That she had become optional. The Friday she heard, it was an ordinary Friday. She hadn't built it into anything in her mind. She'd made the soup the night before, her hands knowing the recipe without needing to think. She'd dropped Flo at her mother's for the weekend. Flo, who was 7 and had her father's focus and her mother's habit of noticing everything, who had asked that morning without looking up from her cereal, "Are you going to see Daddy at his office?" And Brielle had said yes. And Flo had said okay, with the quiet acceptance of a child who has learned that seeing a parent is a category of hope you hold loosely. She'd parked in the visitor structure and carried the soup through the lobby and taken the elevator to 14 and smiled at the receptionist, Janelle, who had started 6 months ago and had quickly learned that Friday afternoons often meant Brielle Calloway with a container of something warm. Janelle had smiled and said he was in a meeting that had run long, and Brielle had said, "Of course, I'll wait." She'd waited 40 minutes. At the 40-minute mark, she'd asked to use the restroom. Janelle had pointed her toward the hallway that ran alongside the secondary conference rooms. She'd walked down and back, and on the way back, she'd heard Garrison's voice first. The door to conference room B was open maybe 2 inches, not an invitation, just the casual gap of a room that hadn't been fully closed. Garrison was saying something about the Wentworth media deal, about the timing on the press release, about whether to push it to Monday. Then Tobias's voice. Unhurried. Certain. The voice he used when he wasn't explaining himself so much as simply declaring the shape of reality as he saw it. She's been coming by every Friday for what, 2 years now? Almost 3, Garrison said. A pause. The sound of something being set down on the conference table. Then, "It's a lot. I don't know what she's looking for at this point. I'm not in a place to give her what she's apparently waiting for. And honestly, a breath. If she decided she was finished, I think it would be easier. For both of us. She knows where the door is." Silence on Garrison's end. "Anyway, let's push the release to Monday. I'll call Chen tonight." And just like that, Tobias moved on. Brielle stood in the hallway with her hand resting lightly against the wall and thought about a great many things in a very short amount of time. She thought about the 3 years of Fridays. She thought about Flo saying okay over her cereal bowl with the acceptance of a child who'd already adjusted her expectations downward. She thought about the particular quality of Garrison's silence. The silence of a man who had heard something he didn't want to be in the room for and couldn't leave. She thought about what relief felt like. Then she turned around and walked back down the hallway, back to reception. She set the soup container on Janelle's desk. "Make sure he eats something," she said. She meant it genuinely, without drama, without any performance of dignity, just the honest, uncomplicated statement of a woman who still cared about a person's basic welfare, even at the moment she was done. Janelle looked up, and something in Brielle's face made her not ask any questions, just nod. Brielle walked to the elevator. She rode it down alone. She walked through the lobby and out into the November air, which was cold in the particular Chicago way, not aggressive, just absolute, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Then she walked to her car, sat behind the wheel without starting it, watched the street outside do what streets do, move, indifferent, ongoing, without any interest in the small interior catastrophe happening in a dark blue sedan in the visitor parking structure. She started the car. She did not drive home. The apartment had been rented 8 weeks earlier, not in the aftermath of a fight, not as a reaction to any single moment that had finally broken her patience. Just quietly, methodically, the way Brielle had always approached the things that mattered most, with her full attention and without announcement. She'd found it through a colleague at the clinic, a social worker named Claudette, who knew every good landlord and every bad building on the northwest side and had understood, without Brielle having to say much, that what she was looking for was something that belonged entirely to her. The apartment was the top floor of a 2-flat on a tree-lined block near the park, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a south-facing window, a small back porch that overlooked a yard where the previous tenants had left a vegetable garden, now dormant but clearly well-tended. She'd told no one in Tobias's world, not because she was afraid. She knew him well enough to know that his first response to anything he hadn't planned for was to analyze it, find the actionable information, determine the next move. She didn't want to become a problem he was solving. She wanted to become a woman who was simply elsewhere. She had 1 box already at the apartment, her grandmother's handwritten recipe cards, the soup, the pound cake, a dozen others written in faded ink on index cards that smelled faintly of vanilla and thyme. A photograph from 7 years ago, the summer before she'd met Tobias, standing outside a community health fair in Pilsen, where she'd spent a Saturday doing free screenings and had laughed at something her friend said at the exact moment someone snapped a picture. She looked in that photograph like a woman who was entirely inside her own life, unhurried, unperformed. She hadn't looked at that photograph in years. She'd packed it first. Claudette had connected her to the Hartwell Community Garden 6 blocks from the apartment. A volunteer-run plot where the growing season was long finished, but where, Claudette told her, the winter prep work was substantial, and the coordinator was always looking for organized people who didn't mind the cold. Brielle had gone in twice already. The coordinator was a woman named Agnes, 60-something, with the weathered calm of someone who had been gardening long enough to accept that you do not control outcomes. You only create conditions. Agnes had looked at Brielle's application over reading glasses perched on her nose, and then looked at Brielle herself, and then said simply, "Can you start Saturday?" Brielle had said yes. She drove to the apartment now and let herself in and made tea, and sat at the south-facing kitchen window and listened to the sounds of the street below. A dog, a car with the radio on, someone's front door opening and then closing, the ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of a neighborhood simply existing. She sat there for a long time. And what she felt, in that kitchen with the cold November light coming through the glass and her hands warm around the mug, was something she hadn't felt in longer than she could measure. Quiet. Just quiet, her own quiet, the kind that belonged to nobody else. Tobias got home at 11:15 that night and didn't notice. That is the honest truth of it. He walked through the front door of the house in Lincoln Park, set his keys on the entry table the way he always did, loosened his tie, moved through the first floor with the particular efficiency of a man on autopilot. He put his briefcase on the study floor. He opened the refrigerator, stood in front of it, closed it. He went upstairs. The bedroom was dark. He assumed Brielle was asleep. He was quiet getting undressed. The practiced quiet of a man who had come home late enough times that it had become its own skill, and he got into bed, and within 15 minutes he was asleep. He did not reach across to check. He woke at 6 to a message from Chen about the Monday timeline. He read it lying down, responded, sat up. The other side of the bed was made. He assumed she'd gotten up early. He showered, dressed, went downstairs. The coffee wasn't made. He made it himself, which he was entirely capable of doing, and drank it standing at the kitchen window while he read through the overnight messages. He did not notice her car wasn't in the driveway. He left at 7:30. The house started speaking by the 4th day, not loudly, just in the particular language of a space where someone's presence has been removed without announcement. It was the refrigerator. The way it contained things he'd bought without knowing what to do with them. The impersonal selections of a man who had, without realizing it, outsourced the entire category of food that someone chose specifically for you. It was the hall table. Brielle replaced the flowers there every 5 days, without mention, without fanfare. By day 6, they'd gone brown at the edges. By day 7, they stood in brackish water, and no one changed it because no one had thought about it. It was Flo. Flo came home from her grandmother's on Sunday and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the brown flowers, and then at her father and said, with the precise observation of a 7-year-old who notices everything, "Where's Mom?" Tobias looked at her. "She'll be home later." Flo looked at him for a moment with an expression that was older than 7. "Okay," she said, the same okay she'd given over her cereal bowl on Friday morning. He heard it this time in a way he hadn't before. Garrison came in on the morning of the 5th day without being called, which was itself a small seismic event. In 8 years, Garrison Holt had never once entered a room without being specifically summoned. He stood in the office doorway now, with his hands at his sides and his expression carefully absent of apology. And before he spoke, the fact of his standing there told Tobias that this conversation was going to cost something. "I need you to hear something," Garrison said. Tobias looked up. "I was in the hall when she came out of the restroom on Friday." Garrison held his gaze. "I saw her face when she went back to reception. She wasn't crying. That's the part that. She wasn't crying, and she set the soup down and told Janelle to make sure you ate, and she left." He stopped. "I don't think she's coming back." The silence in the room had a particular quality. "She's at an apartment on the northwest side," Garrison said. "She rented it 8 weeks ago. Her name, her account. She didn't try to hide it. I ran a basic trace when I realized she hadn't gone to any of the usual places." He shifted his weight. "I've known since Monday." "And you waited until now?" "Yes." "Why?" Garrison was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of evasion, the quiet of a man who had chosen a position and understood what holding it cost. "Because," he said, "I was in that conference room on Friday. I was there. And I thought you needed a few days to hear what the house sounds like before I handed you information you'd use to go fix it, before you understood what needed fixing." He paused. "I thought you needed a few days." Tobias looked at the surface of his desk for a long moment. "She volunteers at the Hartwell Community Garden on Saturdays," Garrison said. 6 blocks from the apartment." He paused. "I drove past on Saturday morning. She was talking to the woman who runs the place, and she was laughing." He said it the way he said only the things that mattered, without framing or cushion. "I don't have a position. I'm just telling you I was there on Friday and I saw her face. And she was still smiling at Janelle after 40 minutes of waiting, and then she walked out, a beat. And her face after, that's the part I can't unsee." Something moved across Tobias's face, quick as a shadow, gone before it could be named. "Get out, quiet, no heat." Garrison left. Tobias sat in his office for 2 hours after that and looked at nothing on his desk. He thought about the soup container on Janelle's desk, about make sure he eats something, not tell him I'm done, not tell him he'll regret this. Just the specific, uncomplicated instruction of a woman who still cared about a person's basic welfare at the moment of walking away. He thought about 3 years of Fridays, 40-minute drives, soup made the night before, waiting in the seating area by the elevator for him to become available. He thought about Flo's okay, the particular weight of it. He picked up his phone and called his attorney and said when she answered, "I need to understand what a separation would look like. Both directions, full picture." And when she started to ask questions, he said, "I'm not initiating. I need to know where I stand. There's a difference." He hung up. He sat at the desk and looked at the window. The city outside was doing its indifferent November thing, gray, ongoing, entirely unbothered by whatever was happening in an office on its eastern edge. He thought about a Friday 7 months ago when he'd been in the middle of a call that couldn't be interrupted, and Garrison had come in and written on a notepad, "Brielle is in the lobby." He'd nodded and kept talking. And then after the call, there'd been a meeting, and after the meeting, another call. And by the time it occurred to him to go downstairs, it was past 8, and she was long gone. And there was a soup container sitting on the reception desk, and he'd felt a brief, vaguely guilty flicker of something he'd then set aside because he had another call. He sat very still. The thing about a man like Tobias, the specific architecture of how he'd built what he'd built and become who he'd become doing it, was that he did not allow himself to be surprised by his own life. He read the room, he assessed the situation, he moved before the situation could determine the outcome for him. He had not read this room. He had been in this room for 4 years and had not noticed it going quiet. He had been so certain she would always be there that he had never once treated her like someone who might not be. He began going to the Hartwell Community Garden on Saturday mornings 6 weeks later. Not to see Brielle. He told himself that clearly in the private language he used when he needed to be honest with himself about motivation. He told himself it was because the anonymous donation he'd made, specific, unglamorous, the exact dollar amount the garden needed to replace the raised beds damaged in the September storm, a number he'd found by reading 3 years of their public financial records and doing arithmetic on a yellow legal pad at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, deserved accountability. He wanted to see where the money was going. Agnes opened the door when he knocked. She looked at him with the evaluating calm of a woman who had spent decades watching what people were willing to do with their hands, not just their intentions, and said without ceremony, "You've never done anything like this before." "No," he said. "You look like you think showing up is the hard part." "I know it isn't." She opened the door wider. "We have 2 beds to winterize and a tool shed that needs reorganizing. You can start there." He started there. He worked for 2.5 hours without being asked twice about anything. He did not try to reorganize Agnes's existing system. He did not make suggestions nobody had asked for. He just did what she told him and paid attention and discovered, against his expectations, that the doing of something physical and uncomplicated, the cold, the soil, the visible specific result of a task completed, had a quality that no amount of strategic problem-solving had ever produced. No leverage, no opponent, just the work and what it left behind. At 11, he heard her voice. He knew it the way you know a voice that has been part of the architecture of your daily life for 4 years. Before he registered it consciously, his body registered it. His hands stilled for 1 second. Then he kept working. Brielle came through the side gate with a canvas bag over her shoulder and stopped completely when she saw him. The stop was total, not a flinch. A full, absolute stillness, the kind that happens when the body receives information the mind hasn't processed yet. She stood in the gateway in her heavy coat with the canvas bag, and she looked at him, and her expression was one he had not seen before on her face. Not anger, not the careful neutrality she'd learned to wear around him in the last year. Something more open than either. Something that had the quality of a woman who had done the hard work of building a new geography for herself, and had just found an old landmark standing in the middle of it. Tobias. Brielle. They looked at each other across 20 feet of winter-dormant garden. "Agnes knows who you are," she said. "She knows my first name." "That's not what I asked." Her jaw tightened slightly. She set the canvas bag down on the nearest bench. "How long have you been coming here?" "Today is the first time." She studied him with the steady, rigorous attention he'd always loved, and had, somewhere along the way, started to find inconvenient, which was, he understood now, its own kind of confession. "The donation," she said, "the anonymous one." He said nothing. Agnes couldn't figure out where it came from. The amount was exact. Not close, exact. Her voice was level, but something in it had shifted slightly, the way a room changes when a window is opened. "You read our financials." He didn't deny it. She looked at him for a long moment. Agnes's voice drifted from the far side of the garden. A bird crossed the gray sky above them. "I can't tell you not to be here," Brielle said. "It's not mine to tell you." "I know." But if this is a strategy, she stopped, reorganized. If this is the version of showing up that is still underneath about controlling what happens next. I know, he said again, quieter. Do you? He looked at her directly. The particular quality of his attention, the thing that had always been both compelling and exhausting about him, the absolute focus of a man who was rarely entirely present, but when he was entirely present, settled on her with its full weight. I don't know what I'm doing, he said. That's the honest answer, for the first time in 20 years, and I'm trying to find out. Something moved through her expression. Then Agnes called Brielle's name from across the garden, and she turned and answered, and the moment ended, and she picked up her bag and walked toward the main beds. Tobias turned back to the tool shed and finished what he'd started. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. Agnes started giving him tasks without the evaluative pause, just direction, the way she directed anyone who had proven they weren't going to need management. He learned which beds needed the most protection going into deep winter. He learned the name of a regular volunteer named Doug, who'd been coming every week for 6 years, and who, on the third Saturday, showed up and handed Tobias a coffee without a word, which Tobias understood as its own form of acceptance. He learned that there was a particular satisfaction in doing a thing that left something better than it found it, without anyone needing to know it was you who did it. Brielle was there on Saturdays. They worked in parallel. They talked occasionally in the practical register of shared purpose. Can you carry that? Agnes needs someone at the east bed. The bag by the fence is compost, not tools. Small and functional. The careful language of two people maintaining a coexistence inside shared purpose without making it into more than it was. It was more than he deserved, so he took it and did not push on it. On a Tuesday in early December, Garrison called in the morning. The Wentworth deal has a problem, he said. Not a discrepancy, a trap. You need to see this before the noon call. Tobias listened for 11 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, clear my morning and get Chen on the phone. In person. Today. He went to the office and spent 6 hours in focused, certain motion. Calls, decisions, 2 moves that were ugly but clean, 1 conversation that required him to call in something he'd been owed for 3 years, and that the person on the other end accepted with the tone of a man who'd been expecting it and was grateful it had arrived as a phone call and not something less conversational. By mid-afternoon, the situation was handled, cleanly. He sat in the empty conference room after everyone left and looked at the city through the windows. The same city, the same gray December sky, taxis and delivery trucks and people with places to be. He thought about a dormant garden and the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing done right. He thought about Brielle's face in that gateway. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday. The envelope sat on the corner of his desk for 4 days before he opened it. The language was careful and fair, no aggression, no punitive reach into anything she could have reached for and chose not to. A clean, equitable accounting of what the marriage had been and what it was worth. Tucked inside the last page was a handwritten note. He read it once, then put it face down on the desk. He picked it up and read it 6 days later, a Sunday morning, at the kitchen table of the Lincoln Park House, while Flo ate cereal, and told him with complete authority about the plot of the book she was reading. I'm not writing this because I'm angry. I want to say that first, because I know it's the lens you'll read everything through if I don't. I'm not angry, and I'm not punishing you. For a long time, I tried to figure out how to say that I needed more of you, and then I realized the more I needed wasn't available, not for this. Maybe it never was. I don't know. That's not a condemnation. It's just the truth as I understand it. Thank you for the years that were good. I hope you take care of yourself. I mean that without any other meaning attached. He folded it and put it in his inside jacket pocket. He did not take it out again, but he didn't leave the house without it. On a cold Saturday in late December, he found her at the south bed, talking to Agnes. She was laughing at something, not performing anything, just standing there in the gray morning with her breath visible in the cold, laughing, with the unguarded ease of a woman who had made a costly decision and found that the cost was worth it. He watched her for 4 seconds. Then he went to his assigned bed and started the work Agnes had given him. An hour later, Brielle came and worked beside him. They worked in silence for a while, the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't require filling. "Flo asked about you," she said eventually. He kept working. What did she ask? "Whether you'd been to the garden." "A beat." I told her yes. "What did she say?" She said, "Is he good at it?" Something almost like a smile crossed Brielle's face. "I told her you were learning." He looked at her. She looked back. 12 feet of winter garden between them. "The papers," she said. "My attorney says you haven't responded. Not a counterfiling, not even an acknowledgement." "No. That's unusual for you." "It is," he agreed. She studied him with the steady attention that had always seen through the performance to whatever was actually underneath. "Tell me what you heard," she said. "When you finally understood I wasn't coming back, what did you actually hear?" He thought about the question, about what she was really asking, not what happened, but whether he understood the full weight of it. "I heard the house," he said, "what it sounded like without you in it." He held her gaze. "I heard Flo say okay in the way she'd learned to say it, because expecting more was something she'd quietly stopped doing. And I understood, I didn't want to understand it, but I did, that I'd been treating you like infrastructure, like something that would simply continue existing whether or not I showed up to it." She was quiet. "You didn't leave because you were angry," he said. "You left because you'd already been gone, in every way that mattered, and staying had become just the habit of staying." Something moved through her expression. She looked away for a moment, then back. "The man in that conference room," she said quietly, "and the man who's been here every Saturday learning how to winterize beds." She paused. "Are those the same man?" "Yes." He didn't hesitate. "I know that's not what I'd like to say. I'd like to tell you the one who said what he said to Garrison was a different version, a bad stretch, something I can point to and say that wasn't really me. But it was. The same man who built something I let crowd everything else out also drove here on the coldest Saturday in November and did what Agnes told him without arguing." He looked at her steadily. "I can't give you a cleaner story than that. They're the same man, trying to make different choices." She sat with that. Her hands were loose in her lap, not braced, not defending anything. "I didn't change my mind because of the donation," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know." Or the Saturdays. She looked at the ground between them. Though the arithmetic on the financials, she shook her head slightly. That was very you. "There was a gap," he said simply. And something in the repetition of it, the plainness of it, the complete absence of drama, opened into something larger than the words. Both of them heard it. The gap that had been there for 2 years before she walked out of his building. The gap that had opened so gradually that by the time it had width, it was already the width of an 8-week-old apartment and a dormant garden and a woman who'd packed a photograph of herself from before she knew he existed. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out an envelope. He recognized its dimensions. "It's unsigned," she said. She held it out. He took it. He looked at it without opening it. "I'm not saying we go back to what we were," she said, and her voice was steady in the way of someone who has found their footing after a long time without it. "We can't. That's not available anymore. But I've been watching 4 months of something that wasn't built for my benefit, something you'd be doing even if I never found out about it." She held his gaze. "And I think there's something worth finding out on the other side of this, if you want to find out." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the first Friday, the 40-minute drive, the lobby security, the soup, warm through the glass, the way something in his face had shifted when he'd understood that she'd made it and driven it here without being asked, just because she'd noticed he hadn't eaten. He thought about 3 years of Fridays becoming shorter, 30 minutes becoming 20, becoming 10, becoming a container of soup on the reception desk with a quiet instruction for someone who wasn't him. He thought about the conference room door. 2 inches of gap, and the specific quality of Garrison's silence in the days that followed, the silence of a man who had understood that some things once said have their own gravity. He put the envelope in his inside jacket pocket. "One thing," he said, "one condition." She waited. "If I become background again, if you start to feel optional to yourself because of me, I need you to say it directly, not for my comfort. Because I'd rather know than keep assuming. I have spent enough of the last 4 months learning what I should have already known." She looked at him. The quiet between them had changed from the quiet of distance to the quiet of two people making a decision at the same time. "And if you check your phone at dinner," she said, "I'm going to take it and put it somewhere inconvenient." He almost smiled, stopped himself, then didn't stop himself. "Okay," he said. She looked at the garden around them, the bare beds, the cold soil, the gray December sky above the fence line. 2 trees at the garden's north edge, stripped of everything, holding only the structural fact of branches against winter. "Those will bloom in April," she said. "Agnes told me. Some kind of flowering cherry." "That's 4 months from now." "I know what 4 months is," she said quietly. They stood with that for a moment, the garden around them still. The city moving beyond the fence, indifferent and ongoing, entirely unbothered by the 2 people in the cold, deciding whether what they had was still alive. Then Brielle picked up her canvas bag and went back to work. After a moment, he went back to his bed and finished what he'd started. They worked side by side until Agnes called the morning session to a close, and then they walked out through the gate together into the December street, not holding hands, not making any announcement, just 2 people walking in the same direction at the same pace, which is sometimes how the hardest things begin. Behind them, the cherry trees held nothing, the cold held everything, and April was exactly as far away as it needed to be.